This is Changeling the podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the podcast. Come for the glamour, stay for the vibes. I'm your host Josh, and with this is your other host Puka. Say hi, Puka.
How do?
What are we talking about today, Puka?
We will be diving into the supplement Kingdom of Willows, which is about the eponymous realm in the southern part of Concordia.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It's like all of the South, but Florida, and maybe
Right. Florida's its own particular.
I couldn't tell if Texas is part of it.
No, Texas is at the Kingdom of the Burning Sun, apparently.
Okay,
But yeah, their definition of the South. I mean, there are lots of definitions of the South, of course, but the one that they're using here is kind of like south of the Mason-Dixon lines, then the Ohio River, but then also Arkansas and Louisiana, but not Florida. So it's like, okay.
Yeah. Is DC traditionally the South? Anyway,
it depends who you ask. So.
Yep. Anyway, yes, this was written by Jackie Caseta and Nikki Ria, developed by Ian Lemke still. This is another, unfortunately, very black and white book.
Yeah, it is, in my opinion, a criminal act to have Rebecca Guay art in black and white.
Mm-hmm.
And this book has numerous examples of that. Anyway, so it is worth pointing out that this book is about the southern United States, which has had, to put it as politely as possible, a fraught relationship historically with issues of race and class and a few other things. This book, we can talk about how well it handles those things when we get to the end, maybe, but as we go through this episode, there might be a couple points where we just flag a couple things and say, hey, this part of the book is actually kind of gross. So
yeah, it definitely tries to handle these things.
It tries. I'm not convinced it entirely succeeds.
Yeah.
There are a number of sort of small moments throughout the book, in particular character descriptions that tend to focus on skin color. But then there are like a few really overtly icky pieces, which I understand why they included. I just don't want to read them. So
there's also a lot of language usage choices, and I don't know how much this is from 1998 or not.
Well, yeah. I think that's part of it. It is also worth saying that Jackie and Nikki were kind of well established in, I think, near Asheville. So kind of at the center of the Kingdom of Willows. And like, I think of this book as kind of like their love letter to the region. So it shows. But
I just kept thinking, like, I think White Wolf was still based out of Atlanta at the time, which is the capital of the Kingdom of Willows.
Yes. Well, it's convenient for doing the research, I suppose. I would hope that Atlanta is more accurate than some of the other city books that we've seen.
Yes. This is an area where I definitely have no idea. I'm not I would not be the person to write it. So
yeah, I have limited experience. So
so yeah, it opens up at a party. I actually kind of like a lot of the story in here, but I have to say it read to me like the least chemistry of any romantic relationship between David and his how do you pronounce her name?
Ferelith.
They have the way it's written. There's just I thought they were trying to set it up as being like, no, but I think they're supposed to be genuinely love each other, but it just does not read that way.
It's maybe also worth pointing out that this book was written by lovely queer folks. So
yes. Oh, and there's lots of other great writing here. It's just this bit is like, I guess they don't know how to write couples. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I would know how to do like a straight romance scene either. So
yeah,
but it is definitely like a metaplot advancement story, because it's when we previously had Immortal Eyes, those were all kind of setting / story idea books or sample story books, some of which connected to the running thread of the Immortal Eyes quest. This is like the broad second edition metaplot. This is really the first point where it gets pushed forward. Chapter 6 actually gives like a blow by blow, but the brief sort of summary is that it's the wedding reception of High King David and his bride Ferelith, whom some people think he fell in love with suspiciously quickly. And they're at the home of her uncle, Melge, the King of Willows. And it seems he's maneuvered his ward into a position to become High Queen, then executes this plan to sort of remove David from the political equation by drugging him and getting him beaten up with cold iron. So then he convinces David to abdicate his throne because he's like, oh, they're coming for you. You better abdicate. And then Caliburn deserts him. So he's like, oh, I guess I'm really not king anymore. And as everyone's kind of running around trying to figure out what's going on, Caliburn appears to Safe, an Ishu, who gets knighted on the spot by Ferelith and quested to find David. And Ferelith herself insists on setting out to complete the royal tour to kind of drum up support around Concordia. There's also like this metaphor of the magnolia, and there are these scenes where they're like, oh, don't touch the magnolia or it'll wither before your eyes. I don't recall magnolias ever doing that when I've
I
encountered them
thought that was
before.
like a magic magnolia, but
I guess so. Anyway, so that's the scene setting prologue.
yeah.
And perfectly fine, I guess.
I think my favorite character in this was Melge. Or Melge?
I say Melge.
Melge. Okay.
I like Sir Safe. I think Sir Safe is my favorite,
Mm.
especially when he appears in later books. But
Yeah, I'm just thinking distinctly of what they wrote here for him. But it's not bad, but
he is a great villain. I'll say that.
mm-hmm.
So then we get into the introduction.
Yeah, it describes a whole bunch of books I've never read.
Well, it also has the line, the first source book for the realms that make up the Kingdom of Concordia, and I'm thinking, and last, because we did not get any other Kingdom books. So I guess War in Concordia was kind of a Kingdom of Apples book, but not nearly to the same level of detail
No,
as this one.
just the Kingdom of San Francisco book.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, we have sort
Bunch of
of
films I haven't seen.
yeah. I mean, they did their due
Okay, I saw
diligence
Forrest
when it
Gump.
comes to media references and suggested reading and viewing. I certainly haven't read most of the history and culture, geography, and travel stuff, but in terms of like the fiction, they talk about Faulkner and McCullers and O'Connor,
Mm-hmm.
Alice Walker, Alex Haley, Ernest Gaines. Like, there's some good names on here. Maya Angelou, Tennessee
Mm-hmm.
Williams. Films wise, though, it's kind of like whenever I see a media reference list like this, I almost wish that there was a delineation between here's stuff that you should probably read and watch to get a general sense of like the background ethos of the setting, and then
Mm-hmm.
here's stuff that you should read or watch because it's applicable to the game.
Yeah.
Because when I see something like Gone with the Wind or Deliverance, I wouldn't like recommend those films to anyone
Mm-hmm.
for any reason probably, but
Yeah.
I understand that they're part of the general discourse of what the
Mm-hmm.
South is, whether or not it's accurate. So
Yeah. I
like,
think Interview the Vampire. That's another movie I'd seen. That maybe that shouldn't have been for either of this.
right, well, and I can imagine that for the vampire supplement New Orleans by
Yeah.
Night, because it's probably more accurate than that book with its claims of sewers and
A
subways.
subway.
So
Yes.
but yeah, I don't know, some of these, your mileage may vary, I guess. We also have some information here where we're told the mood is about the clash of nostalgia and the excitement over new possibilities. And in case you needed a reminder of exactly when this was written, it talks about like, oh, the renewed hope of the recent re-election of President Bill Clinton. Like, oh, that aged in a direction. And then the themes are things like ambition is its own reward, often coming at great cost to personal honor,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually quite elegant as like a unifying principle for a book, and I wish more of them did something like that.
Yeah.
But then also appearances and stereotypes. I would say the book doesn't overall shy away from some of the more difficult parts of the past.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not glossing over them entirely, but I'm concerned that some of the angles they would come across as like
Well, the
apologetics
whole
to the
history
story.
is explicitly written by a puka that they say that.
There is also that, yes.
And then, but it reads. Okay, I have to wait for the history chapter, I guess. But
Yeah. Well, we can proceed
yeah,
to the history chapter. Chapter
so
one.
yeah, it's written by Slevin Teague, Dog Puka, and then there's like a she who's like writing notes critical of it.
She's the tour director.
But the tour director, I think the pukas are more accurate, which is kind of the state.
Well, there is. I mean, the conceit here is that Slevin is the chronicler for King Nage, and that he has provided this history,
Hmm.
which Lady Aramith Nifiona is kind of like adding her little marbleized scented post-it notes to and clarifying a few things. And there are actually a couple points where, sort of in character, she calls out some of what he says, which I think is actually really good. But we'll get to that.
Hmm.
But it's definitely, yeah, the definition of an unreliable narrator. And I'm like,
Hmm.
cleverly done, writers. Cleverly done.
Yeah. And it starts with Nunahi were here. And
And some of the awkward pre-shattering she's
I mean,
not
the way they did
not
it,
too
like,
much though.
I feel like if you had to keep it in, the way they did it in this book, given it was already there, if they weren't trying to contradict it, it's like, oh, they just were more white people. Okay.
Yeah,
Like in the Americas, that just happened to show up early is how it's written before the Black Death.
yeah. And it is nice that we do actually get a significant amount of information about the Nunyahi
Hmm.
that's more three-dimensional than what we've seen so far.
Yeah.
So that at least we get that first, which is good. I assume for like the trolls coming with Vikings to New York and the Shi across the Traz to the southeast, I assume there was some kind of feedback about that because unlike when we've seen that previously, where it's just kind of a given, it's kind of mitigated repeatedly here, where like,
Hmm.
oh, this might just be legend. Oh, some of those Shi, they were poorly behaved from the start, even though they say that they made friends with the Nunyi. So I guess that's good.
Yeah. It was like some made alliances and some of the sheep broke the alliances, and they also just conquered places, but
Yeah.
also made treaties, which is just how colonization happened, I guess. So.
Yeah. There is a suggestion that even though the Sundering and then the Shattering were kind of catalyzed in Europe, that it hit the Americas at the same time, which
Hmm.
I feel like contradicts what we've seen before about the Shattering kind of unfolding at different points in time. But
It depends on what you mean by the shattering.
I suppose, yeah.
So when we did our dreams and nightmares episodes, when it talked about what the shattering is, it describes it very differently from some other books, and this feels like the dreams and nightmares shattering,
Mm,
as it not the autumn world like the dreaming shattering hit,
yeah, yeah.
but not the autumn world as much.
Yeah. It does post-date Dreams and Nightmares, so
Yeah, and then it talks about a second shattering, but
mm,
that's the autumn world with colonization and stuff. So.
yeah. I will admit I don't know how much of the information is accurate that we get about the indigenous folks. Like,
Hmm.
given that this was the 90s, I assume it was taken from some kind of encyclopedia of
Yeah,
unknown
and I know,
accuracy.
again, I don't know much about these regions in general, so it's let alone.
So then we get some colonial bits. There's a nice little sidebar about the lost colony at Roanoke, which hints at a possible connection with werewolf. And it's certainly less
Hmm.
fraught than the Madoc the She stuff and some
Hmm.
other pieces. This entire chapter, the feel that it gave me, it felt more like a social studies textbook than most history sections. But
Yeah,
given the sort of dearth of information we got in places like some of the Kith books, I think I'm okay with it.
yeah. It reads to me like a high school, like grade 9 or 10 history
Right. Yeah,
textbook,
yeah,
but
yeah.
then throwing in changeling stuff, and I'm like,
Right. It's like history, but contextualized, which is good.
mhm.
I mean,
I knew some of the things in here, but there's a lot of things I didn't know, which means I don't know if it's accurate. But I mean, it's still handy to have that if you're going to
yeah.
be referencing it later.
Yeah, there's a lot in here about the sort of indigenous and European conflicts of the time. Like that's sort of the defining narrative for
Hmm.
this portion. I did really love the sidebar on privateers and pirates, and I really wish that there was more for that.
Hmm.
And they mentioned Steed Bonnet from Our Flag Means Death because he was a real person. It's lovely. The gentleman pirate who just decided to be a pirate one day. But it is sort of a more changelings were present for / subtly influenced history rather than the old like vampire trick of yeah, so and so is a vampire or made
Hmm.
for that matter.
Yeah, there was a few like this person probably wasn't a changeling, but they should have been, or
Right.
this person. They rumored this person's a Andrew Jackson's a Dantean, but nah, it doesn't seem right.
Just autumn. Just terrible.
Yeah.
Just a terrible person.
Hmm.
So Someday I want to do a Thieves of Bryce Paradise book too and just go all in on
Hmm.
the pirate stuff, but that's for another day.
Hmm.
In the meantime, so we kind of go through the Carolinas, we go through Georgia, New Orleans, and the Gulf Coast, like just kind of. This is why I said it reminds me of a social studies textbook because I remember learning like the history of each of those in the colonial
Hmm.
era in school, and then leading up to the Revolutionary War and the involvement of Indigenous allies, creation of DC.
It was short, but like the write up on War of 1812 was not incorrect in my opinion.
Ah, see, interesting, because that I imagine you learned a lot more about in school than I did.
Yeah, no one won, and the indigenous people lost. Is the
Yeah, which is followed pretty quickly by the Trail of Tears
yeah.
discussion. There's an interesting note in here. I can't remember where I saw it, but there's the implication that European Kithain see Concordians as, quote, half barbaric children. And I'm like,
Yep.
did we see that before? I don't remember that like being a.
I think there was some stuff in Isle of the Mighty, or maybe the what was the Ireland
Mm,
book again, where they were like, King David's obviously not the High King of the world. He's just
right.
the American king.
Still, though. So I feel like now that we're kind of getting into the 1800s part of the history in particular,
Hmm.
so the plantation system and slavery are discussed to an extent, but they keep getting interrupted by kind of hitching them to one-off historical events and things like the War of 1812. So it ends up being a more of this like historiographic discussion than
Hmm.
an emotional one. We kind of learn about the causes and consequences of these systemic injustices without really a moral or emotional commentary. And I don't think that really does the discussion any favors, especially because there's pretty limited information about how the Kithain were involved. And like,
Hmm.
if I'm left to draw my own conclusions, they don't look good, you know?
Yeah, and that's the thing. Too, like I was thinking about this, like as a grade 9 history textbook, I thought it did an okay job,
Mm,
but and the bolting on the Fae just felt like past the Nunahi part, like once you got to like
mhm.
colonization and whatnot, it was just mostly just like yeah, okay. And then the
Yeah.
Fae in the Civil War, they fought on both sides. I'm like,
Yeah. Well, I'll get to that in a minute, but
yeah, but it was just a lot of, and then the Fae did the stuff the humans did. Okay,
right.
good, whatever. I could have guessed that.
And I don't necessarily think that they would, I guess, is part of my issue, or
Hmm.
at least not with the same sort of like proportions. I don't know. I'm going to have more to say about this when we get to like the individual characters part. But I
Yeah.
think overall, the author seemed especially invested in foregrounding the plight of the local indigenous groups, but it often felt like it came at the expense of talking about other forms of racism or prejudice.
They did talk a lot about it. They didn't keep slavery out of it, like by any stretch.
Yeah, but I
It's just
feel
it was
like
very clinical. Yeah,
yeah, that's the way to put it. Yeah. Whereas talking about the Nunhi didn't feel clinical. That felt a lot
yeah,
more emotionally involved. But that being said, there are two notes from Lady Aramaith, the tour planner, which are fantastic. And like the one is, hey, maybe the Nunhi don't like you, not because of the pre-shattering she stuff. Maybe it's the fact that you did nothing to stop their displacement and profited off the dreams of greed
hmm,
instead. And the other is like, yeah, the Kithain were 100% involved in the lead up to the Civil War. So,
yeah.
like, I like that the history is sort of eliding those details, and she's like calling out the historian and being like, hey, actually. So I don't know what kind of meta commentary is happening there, but I'm here for it.
This actually ties into again unreliable Puka narrator. So, but
Yeah.
this ties
Yeah.
into all of the changeling history stuff about the interregnum. It feels like they're just ignoring the gap of like no Arcadian she, especially back when like the only she here were Skahak, right? But they don't talk about like the way the Kithain society feels the same as now, the way they're acting around the Civil War and all the other things, like it's like it's still the she there somehow.
Yeah.
It's like maybe just some boggins and trolls and knockers filled in the she place. Like it was weird. It's not just here; it's all the books.
There are a couple interesting notes, though. Like, there's a mention that the Ishu used Wayfare on the Underground Railroad, and that the
Yeah,
satyrs and Puka were kind of the bad guys in plantation culture. So there's bits, but yeah, I think this came up before, and I can't remember when, talking about the sort of what were the realms of Concordia before Concordia existed. Like,
Hmm.
we get very little information on that.
Yeah, this gets into, at least later, the Kingdom of Willows was formed, which was.
Mm. Anyway, we have a whole lot of stuff around the lead up to the Civil War and the immediate aftermath, which I kind of don't want to get too deeply into because some of
Hmm.
it, I imagine, will be unpleasant for some folks to listen to. I assume that when they were writing this, they felt like it was kind of necessary to understand Southern dreams, a lot of
Yeah,
what underpins Southern dreams. But I also kind of feel like, especially now, 25 years later, I don't feel like I need a reminder given some of the stuff happening in the world.
I
But
think if you're, especially if this is supposed to be for an international audience, I think it's very important. I'm not saying they did it perfectly the way they did it, but I think that content has to be there in some form.
I guess so. I'm always on edge when I see even the door being cracked open towards any sort of apologetics for historical,
Oh no, I don't mean
bullshit.
that. I think they just need to. I think not covering that historical period would have been bad. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. In any case, post war, they talk about various things about reconstructing with new industries and women gaining more visibility, the sort of recalcitrant racism of a lot of the inhabitants, the
Hmm.
shadow court getting really dominating, I suppose, the politics of the area.
I'm not used to Shadow Court being pre-resurgence, like Interregnum Shadow Court. I don't recall a lot about that before this book.
Yeah, but we have a lot of shadow court NPCs in this book.
Hmm.
So, and yeah, then like you said before, there's the implication that the Fae were caught up in the same sort of fraught politics as their dreamers. But what I really want is for any Confederate Kithain to be long lost to banality, but alas, that's not what we get. So
No, I well, that's we can get into the whole banality doesn't mean bad, and glamour doesn't mean good, and I think that's a really big place to have that.
well, all that aside, I think that it was the death of a major dream
Yeah,
for them.
yeah. I mean, that gets into other things. There's a lot of dreams of death of other dreams in Changeling too.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that in US history, that's one of the big ones. That's one
Yeah.
of the big dead dreams. And I mean, not that that has stopped
Hmm.
certain individuals from trying to resurrect, you know.
Yeah, and there's also the question of at the time versus the semi to fully fascist historical dream
Yeah,
of a thing. So, like, while it was happening, that was pretty banal.
yeah. And the dream is, well, anyway, we don't have to get into
Yeah.
the, we don't have to hash out the full glamour and banality of it, but
Hmm.
it's not a chapter of history that I plan to run a game in, but I understand
No.
why they included it as background. So
Hmm. Yeah, it would be bizarre if there's no reference to any of this in this
yeah,
book
of
on the
course,
South.
of course. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, we get on into the 20th century when they talk about sort of the literary renaissance, which is good
Hmm.
because Southern Gothic is definitely a mood. And they talk about Jim Crow laws as a cause for the Great Migration to the North. I really wish they had touched more on like the origin of blues. I really feel like
Hmm.
that would be a major piece to explore here, but they don't really
Yeah.
get into it. And then the Depression and the World Wars and the Civil Rights Movement. I also have the note in here that I feel like repeatedly history is being racialized in the text, which I'd be more open to if it didn't feel oversimplified. I suppose it
Mm.
had to be for a role playing supplement. Like, that's not the main point of the book. And again, the 90s were a different time. But I don't know. I keep finding myself left feeling uncomfortable because it keeps getting brought up, but not really sufficiently dealt with to my taste.
Mm.
I don't know. Anyway, the racist past. It exists alongside the racist present.
Hmm. And then some things, yeah, the Depression, World War. Some of it read like, okay, yeah, I've read this section in how many Changeling books,
Mm,
and then they're going off to fight in World War II, and and it's just Southern Kithain rather than other Kithain from the other books, for sure.
yeah. Although something that will come back later is the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee,
Hmm.
which I thought was a interesting tidbit to include.
Yeah, I'm not even complaining about that rehashing it. I think you kind of have to do it. It's just you read enough history chapters in these
Yeah.
books, and you're like,
And then we have the Resurgence, which really, like, the Resurgence and what follows gets so little space by comparison.
I This book seems to imply that the Accordance War was mostly in like New York. I'm a little bit
Yeah.
confused by that. Wouldn't there have been She all over the place?
Well, so California, the Great Plains, and the Northeast seem to have been the main battle areas.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more of that in Fool's Luck, Way of the Commoner when we get to that. Like the big battles were sort of Manhattan and Philadelphia and the Battle of the Plains
Yeah.
and San Francisco and all that. It's interesting that the noble commoners saw the returning Shi as carpetbaggers too. I kind of thought that was an interesting piece. But then we have sort of some setup for the metaplot. We learn that the King of Willows prior to Mergia was Barabbas, who had seized the kingdom
Mm-hmm.
thanks to, quote, Shermanesque campaigns, which I'm just going to roll my eyes and move on from that adjective.
Yep.
There was a revolt in 1990 that ended in his assassination by Mergia.
I just read it as he has lots of tanks. Sorry.
Sure. For context, in the state of Georgia in particular, my understanding is that there's still a lot of bitterness over General Sherman's march to the sea in the Civil War when he kind of started
Mm.
at one corner of the state and went to the other, burning and pillaging along the way.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't catch
Yeah,
that.
that's
Okay.
the.
Yeah. I was just thinking Sherman tanks. Yeah, they got these.
We didn't cover that in Canadian World History class.
No.
So I wish we had more sort of actual information about the area, the autumn version, since 1969. There's bits that say, like, Milga solicits investment by industry and land development, which actually has become quite an issue in the 25 years since this book came out. But that's really it. I mean, I feel like
Mm-hmm.
the tone through the whole section, if I had to sort of encapsulate it, is like the South is much more complicated than people give it credit for. It's often
Yeah.
misunderstood and but it has its share of issues. And I'm like, well, all right.
I found it kind of dry, the tone, like the writing style.
I don't know that I would call it dry. I would call it trying to be neutral, like struggling for neutrality.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of the vibe that I get from it.
I have no idea how I'd play the puka that actually wrote this. I think is my biggest.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lovely the missive at the end by Aramis that kind of
Mm-hmm.
bookends it. There's that piece about the king mirrors the land and the land mirrors the king, and it actually is a nice sort of summary of the state of things, better than we actually
Mm-hmm.
get in the Puka history stuff. Frankly, it's difficult to read this now because I feel like in the last 25 years, a lot of the issues that they point to have kind of just become entrenched and exacerbated. And I can only imagine that for the two of them living there in the 90s, it was kind of like things were on the up and up and there was a lot of hope and promise. And I just don't know if those promises have ever really borne fruit, especially
Mm.
with a lot of what's going on politically. But yeah,
Maybe we'll see in a few years. 'Cause
yeah.
something's happening.
Anyway, that's chapter one.
Mm-hmm.
I feel
So
we should
maybe.
point out that this book is a very dense one.
Yeah.
Like, it's shorter than Isle of the Mighty, but it's probably about as dense as Isle of the Mighty.
Yeah.
So
We do chapter 2 geography.
let's do it.
This wasn't written by that Puko, right? This is just
It
supposed to
was
be.
not. This is the omniscient voice, which is good. I actually will
Yeah.
say I do really like the setup of this chapter. So basically, the
Mm-hmm.
Kingdom of Willows consists of the 13 duchies. How many is it? But each one kind of gives some lush language to set the scene. They talk about physical geography and major cities or
Mm-hmm.
landmarks, and then the natural and enchanted places, almost all of which have at least one or two story hooks, if not several, kind of thrown in there. And that's what I like to see from a geography chapter. There is a lot
Yeah.
of tourist guidiness kind of scattered through, especially for parts where it seems like they're talking about states they haven't been to, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not overwhelming and there's enough other stuff that I feel like it's still usable.
Well, this is also. It's not in the age of. It wasn't written in the age of Wikipedia, but it feels like it's getting closer to it with how they wrote it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they have all these like read these other things
Yeah.
if you want more information.
Indeed. Should we just rocket through these?
Yeah.
All right. So we start with Willow's Heart, which is Georgia, and Atlanta is the royal domain. I can't recall if other kingdoms have a royal domain like this. Maybe they were supposed to, but we don't really hear a lot about that. Because like there's King Myeongje, but there's also a baroness. Like I don't know. I'm just kind of confused by the actual feudal structure of this. But anyway,
Oh. Yeah, that's sort of how I assumed it worked, but it could just be that's.
yeah. There's a lot of talk about Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil in relation to Savannah because that book and film had recently come out and were
Mm.
sensations at the time. There's mention of glamour from sports, there's the Botanical Garden, the Fox Theater, there's universities, and not a single mention of Dragon Con, which I think
Yes.
existed by that point.
Or the headquarters of Black Dog Game Studios.
Yeah. So they also say the natural kingdom's heart are the sea islands on the coast, which are a Seder Puka pirate base, and then we don't hear anything more about that again, and I'm curious. Important places include Milga's Palace and Willow's Heart proper, Wisteria Hall and Savannah, so you kind of have this Sealy versus unseelie, Savannah versus Atlanta kind of thing, as well as the Florist Primeval Freehold that we read about in Freeholds and Hidden Glens, the Barony of Vellumpton, led by Aron and Elowin around the college town of Athens, and then the Echota Council lands, which are the Nunyahi domain up north. And I was like, oh, awesome. That's really cool that it exists. And then there's the note that they spend all their time attacking Willow's Heart. And I'm like,
Yeah.
so, Georgia.
Although after you read more about Willow's Heart, I kind of want to attack it too, but still.
Yeah. Oh, I'm not saying they're in the wrong. It's just,
Yeah.
I would hope they do other things sometime.
Mm-hmm. So we got Duchy of Cotton, which is there's a lot of political intrigue things. So it's in theory Alabama and Mississippi, but maybe it's just Alabama because there's a disputed Duchess of Mississippi, basically. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, and Mississippi is Magnolia's home,
Mm-hmm.
which actually sounds more interesting to me. I mean, they kind of list a bunch of stuff in both, but the Mississippi stuff seems like more story potential to me,
Yeah.
especially the Faulknerite muses in Oxford, Mississippi.
Yeah. One thing these all have is a natural places section, which I think is really
Yeah,
interesting.
and it gives an opportunity to kind of showcase some of the Nunyahi
Mm-hmm.
freeholds and connections.
So yeah, they have the enchanted places of Ferris Castle, which is like, is that an iron castle? What is that spelled
Well,
right?
he is the Iron Forger for the king,
Yeah,
Duke Firedrake.
and I love his dragon that
Yes.
thinks he's the seneschal of the area of the castle. Yeah,
Yeah.
and then you have Duchess in quotes Igrania in Biloxi.
Biloxi.
Biloxi comes up a lot here. Yeah, they have a rivalry.
Her freehold causes people to slip into bedlam.
Yeah, and then the king's like, "You should sort it out by getting married," and they're both like, "No." And then
Well, and he's in love with her, but she's not in love with him, if I remember rightly.
they eventually say she finds him hot, though.
Mm. One thing that bothered me, they have like these brief references. So, in particular, from Magnolia's home, they talk about river landing along the Dream Mississippi, and the Mississippi is such a storied and legendary river in U.S.
Yeah.
culture, particularly Southern culture, that I kind of felt like it was undersold here. Like there are
Mm-hmm.
moments where they bring it up, and there's the steamboat or not steamboat, the paddle boat freehold, but there's a lot more to unpack from that.
Yep. And
Anyway.
there's Pelican's Roost, tiny freehold run by the Southern preacher healer, faith healer Pelican Puka.
Yep,
Get him more about him
I quite
later.
like him actually.
Yes.
When we get to the characters chapter.
Spirit Rock, which I think
Yes,
I've heard of before, but yeah.
and a lost one freehold, the Magnolia's Grove.
Mm-hmm.
So then we get the Duchy of the Delta Crescent, which is Louisiana, apparently one of the most diverse places in the Kingdom of Willows in New Orleans. But changelings are always kind of freaked out by all the wrought iron there, which probably explains why it's more of a vampire city than a changeling one, in part.
Mm-hmm.
As well as headquarters for a particularly active group of Dantean and
Yeah,
controlled by the Shadow Court.
it's like the Super Shadow Court changeling place.
Yeah. Story potential there.
Yeah.
And I really like this is for the whole chapter. I love the attention to detail about sort of the types of plants and the details about like landforms and waterways. I don't
Yeah.
know. I just really enjoy that.
Yeah, yeah, this really does feel like it's a Nunahi source book too. Like it's
Yeah.
very much
Yeah, yeah,
meant
yeah.
for that from your Nunahi game, and it even like presents it as like, Here's how your groups you could have multiple different Nunnehi kiths together.
Yeah. And it's a more solid representation than the other options. So
Yeah.
not that it's perfect, but
Mm-hmm.
of the ones we have from the
There's a
canon.
lot of taking things and then not contradicting them, but trying to make it better, I think.
Yeah. There's a lot of little notes like the Cajun changelings having an easy come, easy go approach to glamour, or the Duchess funding her wildlife preservation with fundraisers where you can meet a black spiral dancer. Like, that's those are choices, and I like it. But it also makes me like think about again, since this book came out, how much things have changed. I mean, like obviously you have Hurricane Katrina,
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah, this was like at this period of time, like everybody I knew was like, oh, like New Orleans was like one of the places you really wanted to visit one day, and
well, I think
a
it's
lot,
still worth a visit. But
yeah, but there's a lot of dreams around it before the, and
yeah, yeah,
still
yeah.
has it, but yeah, yeah. So then we have. Do you want to move on to the Duchy of Palmetto?
Palmetto
It's all of South Carolina. Sometimes I think they stick too closely to like mortal.
state borders.
Yeah, it's like at least make the
Yeah,
Carolinas one kingdom or duchy or something. I don't know. Especially if you're gonna have Mississippi and Alabama's sort of one. But yeah, it talks about Charleston, Myrtle Beach, which is the only place I knew about it at all.
and one of the most banal places on Earth.
Yeah, it's like your friend. It's like somebody comes back after March break and they're tanned, and it's like, "Where'd you
Ugh.
go? Oh, we just went to Myrtle Beach." Like as the we wanted to go somewhere else, but we went Myrtle Beach instead.
Yeah.
And it's got the Palmetto Court among the enchanted places. Oh, there's a noted satyr enclave dedicated to restoring old Grecian rites,
Yeah,
especially
what
the
was that
drama
about?
competition and dances.
I feel like that must be a reference to something, but I have no idea what.
Maybe there was a weird art colony there that they
I
were.
guess there must have been that they were like fans of. I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of little in jokes that just go right over my head in this book.
I mean, that's how I would do this. I'd be like, talk to people, and they're
Hmm.
like, "Oh yeah, there's a weird thing here." I'm like, "Okay, that's going in here."
That's fair. Yeah. So there's a couple references to the Sea Islands, which are kind of along the coast from South Carolina down through Georgia, being part of the Gullah Free State. And I really wish we had more information about them and the Ochota Council lands because they're
Hmm.
mentioned, but again, we don't really get solid information. And in particular with the Gullah Free State, because we have Ciantilla, who's supposed to be the oldest known changeling, who's been like a changeling for over 80 years. I would rather hear more about that than about like changelings go to Fort Sumter to get glamour from the dreams of secession. I'm like, if I had to pick one, if I had to pick
Yeah.
one thing where I could use more information, but then there's a nymph.
Do we get a nymph here?
I guess she's meant to be a Kubera, but the angel oak nymph.
No, they get into nymphs. Nymphs are a different kind of in anime. We get into that later.
So this was the book before an anime came out, I think. So
Yeah,
Kubera had not been formally. So
yeah. It's
nymph
like
might have still referred to
we'll,
tree.
we'll, we'll get into it when we get to it, but
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
the end
Anyway.
of the book. Yeah.
So then there's the Duchy of the Triangle, which is not all of North Carolina, but the eastern and central part.
What?
A
Yeah.
Knocker's Paradise. There's references to techno changelings, which I kind of like, but knockers
Oh,
and
okay.
redcaps and trolls involved in the university culture. There's a note in here that I think really drives home the point that there are a lot of changelings because the city of Winston-Salem, which is quite small, apparently has a private troll army guarding its student body. And I'm
Mm.
like, Winston-Salem is not that big. So if they can support multiple trolls, let alone
Yeah.
any other kith. But yeah,
Well, yeah. Given how many duchies we have here, and all the duchies have counties, and all the counties have baronies, and
right.
they all have courts, and a bunch of them have like rival courts, and not to mention all the commoners. So.
Yeah. There's notes about the Outer Banks. I was kicking myself when I read through this because when I was doing the Book of Days homebrew supplement, I did have one of them be a Wright Brothers flight memoriam thing. But
Mhm.
I can't remember if I specifically mentioned that like there's this pilgrimage to Kitty Hawk every year that they talk about. And then we get to the big one. Or well,
The
the
Duchy of
important one, I think, from the perspective of the authors, given how
Duchy
many
of Appalachia. Yep. And this felt like follow up from Rage Across Appalachia, which was
Absolutely, yeah.
nominally a Changeling book, but mostly
Yes.
werewolf.
It's their home turf. I get it. I
Yeah.
mean, it's very lushly described, that's what I care
Hmm.
about.
The natural places are as long as all the other ones, though. It's
Yes.
the enchanted places, Orchard Castle, Coal Town. I can't remember which of these. Do they call out the ones, all of them that were previously described?
I think Orchard Castle we very briefly heard about, but didn't get a
Yeah.
write up for. And then High Castle we definitely did. Chimney Tops I think we did in Rage Across Appalachia.
Hmm.
The others I think are all new for this.
Yeah.
We have one of the few examples of a thorp,
What's a thorp again?
a fairy town. In this
Oh,
case,
yeah.
Coal Town.
Hmm.
Kind of like that one in Wales. Oh, the Court of Balsam we also saw before, and the Dancing Ground. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is rehashed from those earlier books. But we
Yeah.
have, like, specific Nunyehi places as well, which is good.
Yeah, it's just interesting. They called out other Changeling books, but they didn't call out Rage Across Appalachia as.
Yeah. To werewolf.
Hmm.
Yeah, but I mean, this is certainly the richest if you're looking for running a chronicle in this area and you want to just have lots
Hmm.
of fey heavy places. This is certainly the place to.
Yep. And a lot of mentions of the werewolf stuff, too.
Yeah. Did you also notice how in the natural places they talk about rumors of glens and groves that host whole families of nymphs?
Yes.
Excellent.
I'll soon get Kiss Book Nymph.
Yes, soon. Maybe by the time this recording actually drops, I'll have started it. So then we get the Duchy of Bluegrasses, which is non-Appalachian Kentucky for the ones who are obsessed with horses. This is where all the fairy steed
Hmm.
stuff comes in. And honestly, I didn't feel like there was much else of interest in this part.
Yeah, it's like, oh, look, there's horses.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, you have the Mammoth Caves piece with like the Slua
Well,
kind of
isn't this where,
hanging
like,
out there.
bluegrass music comes from?
Yeah, exactly. And bourbon for that matter.
Yeah.
Okay, so like sometimes I feel like they're just looking for excuses to fold changelings into whatever local tidbit they can find. So, for example, in Louisville, we have baseball enthusiast Kithain forming a group called the Old Town Sluggers, who are like, I guess, inspired by the dreams of baseball bats. Did that need to be a thing? I mean, like, I guess it adds richness to the world building, but it just takes up space with stuff that I'll probably never use, or if I did, I would be able to come up with it on my own. So,
This is the best geography chapter of the Autumn World that doesn't, in terms of not doing that, but it still does it a lot.
yeah. Best does not mean perfect.
Wait, why does it have Duchy of Bluegrasses and then later under Enchanted Places, Duchy of Bluegrasses?
They actually do that a few times, and I think it's like the capital, the seat of the dukedom.
Yeah.
Because I was curious about that as well, but it happens a few times, and I think that's
Hmm.
just
I like the Freehold of Mammoth.
that's the caves one, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the caves which all have the Slua.
Which is, I'm into it. I could take or leave the rest.
They have lots of secrets that they get from the tourist attraction of caves. There's not. I can't imagine there's much happening around the caves to like
Right.
get political or whatever secrets to whisper to people. But sure.
Next.
The Duchy of Graceland.
So
All this.
yeah, this is the one which we can get into the grossness of its ruler later, but I get that they're highlighting a particular flavor of dark glamour, but man, I don't need it.
Well, we'll get into that.
Yeah.
What's funny is Memphis to me. I think of Memphis as like if I had to pick a place in the Kingdom of Willows as a tech hub, I would have picked Memphis. So that's kind of funny.
Hmm.
But maybe it wasn't in 1998.
Well, there's extensive information about it, which is actually
Yeah.
good. I mean, they really emphasize the musical history, the civil rights history, and then Nashville gets like a bare paragraph. So
Yeah.
and then there's the Duchy of the Ozarks, which I know very little about Arkansas, and I don't think the authors did either. Because
Yeah.
it feels like a checklist of places and names, a few of which have been vaguely changelingified. But that's about it. I guess it's interesting that there's a Slua heir to the title, and there's a lack of political involvement. The character of Leland Joplin Jones, who's a polka jazz pianist who claims Scott Joplin as one of his moral ancestors, into that. But like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very brief, the shortest of all the sections.
Yep. Then we get Duchy of Dogwood, which is the Virginia. It's just Virginia.
See, okay, here's something that bothers me is they have the line, oh, they ignore the arbitrary boundaries between the two. If my memory
Yeah.
serves, they weren't arbitrary at all.
No, and they explain that in the
So,
history chapter. Why?
yeah.
So it's like, I mean, they're all
Yeah.
arbitrary boundaries for states lines, but that one's, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, Washington, D.C. is in Virginia. It's,
Well, included with at least.
yeah.
Yeah, I have feelings about that too, but
Oh, it's a district all to its. Like, why do they need to do that? Like, maybe split it in half? I don't know.
DC is particularly tourist guidey and poorly described in this book.
Yeah.
Like, there's so much more to say about DC, which we have a listener question about that, so we'll get to it later. But yeah, so they say it has overwhelming glamour mixed with overwhelming banality, and I like that. I like that
Hmm. Yeah.
description.
That's how I describe Ottawa, too.
It's very similar to what I've been doing for my write up of New York in the
Hmm.
Changeling sense. So I get that. I do think Shenandoah is criminally undersold for its natural beauty here, and that Charlottesville's name hasn't aged well. But otherwise, this section I was like,
Hmm.
yeah, okay. And this is the one run by the gay couple with very little self awareness, right? If I recall correctly.
The Jewish gay couple.
Well, the Baron Ash
Yeah.
is Jewish. I don't
Yeah.
believe Duke Cormac is. Oh, and
Yeah.
what is with these very extremely buff horsemen on page 71?
I don't know.
I don't know what to do with this picture except frame it.
I think it needs this needs color though, the picture or something.
Yeah,
Like,
definitely.
and then a bunch of enchanted places. A hunt club. That's a hunt club.
Yeah.
Okay. Kind of racist, I think.
There's a lot of moments in this book where I was like, this is kind of racist, I think. So
Why does King David have a secret court in the heart of Washington, D.C.?
I don't know, but I'm okay with it.
Okay.
It's an awesome little sidebar because it references a trod that leads to the deep dreaming, and those are few and far between.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I guess they just felt like, and the Shadow Duchy run by the Shadow Court twins, I think, is also a good story hook.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what I mean. DC, they put some really good hooks in there, but then just didn't really develop the actual location that much.
Yeah.
And I wish they had.
Well, it's weird because they say it's not part of either Dogwood or Chesapeake, but then they make it part of Dogwood.
Well, and frankly, they probably could have just left Chesapeake out entirely. But
Yeah. Oh, and now West Virginia's having its. Okay, I don't remember which of the Virginia and West Virginia. Which one was the Confederate one, and which one was the Union
Virginia
one?
was Confederate. In fact, that's where the capital
Yeah,
was. So.
the more aristocratic, sophisticated changelings east of the mountains,
Right.
and they're anti-Shi because the Shi all live in the Confederate state.
Well, I think they're pointing to Virginia in particular has gotten more and more developed, I mean, and closer tied
Hmm.
to DC, whereas West Virginia has remained very poor and underdeveloped. And there is that
Yeah.
narrative, that discourse kind of in the air. I don't
Hmm.
really know why. Like, I don't think there was really any reason to do a disputed Duchy of Winterthorn other than to kind of make a changeling equivalent to that dichotomy between the two states.
Hmm.
And I guess it's like a tip of the hat to its origins, and they're recasting it instead of Union versus Confederate as commoner versus aristocrat.
Yep.
Yeah, but the
Yeah. It's
landscape's lovely. So,
yeah. It still goes the like every state needs their own duchy except for Alaska. That's obviously just part of Canada.
yes, I mean it sounds beautifully horrific, like like the what's his name, the Duke that's kind of going into Bedlam, but
Hmm.
they really avoided talking about what I would see as the very deep banality among the astounding natural glamour, because it is a very impoverished place where like it's a hard life, and all of the beauty and culture in the world doesn't feed your family, you know.
Yep.
So if we were going to have this as like its own thing, I would have liked a little more about the actual dynamics of the people living there and
Hmm.
the structures there, instead of just here's this duke that thinks he should be duke. At least they mention Harper's Ferry, which is good to mention.
Yep. And then we get to Duchy of Chesapeake.
I'm a little baffled by the assertion that it's an aristocratic bastion, but all right.
Well, Baltimore.
Yes. Baltimore is very well described.
Yeah.
And I mean, Ian Lemke, as we know, has a Storyteller's Vault supplement that is a Baltimore adventure. So I assume
Hmm.
he's been based out of there for a while. I think he mentioned in our interview with him.
Yeah, this whole state, I keep forgetting is at least next to the south. Like it
Yes.
doesn't. I just think of it as, yeah, that's in New England, right? I don't know my map very well.
Well, as a representative of the Mid Atlantic, I have thoughts and feelings. There's very much still a 90s cities are rotten vibe running through the Baltimore description, though.
Hmm.
And we
This
see
is
that,
before The Wire came out.
yeah, not by much, but yeah. And there's a reference, there's a line somewhere earlier where they talk about, like, oh, all of the problems of the industrial cities of the Northeast. On the one hand, I'm like, okay, I get that in the 90s, that was still kind of the, like, my
Yeah.
parents didn't let me go to the city when I was a
I
kid.
mean, it's also the world of darkness.
Sure. But on the other hand, it's not like southern cities were without issues.
Yeah.
So, regardless, there's a lot about Maryland in here, Baltimore
Hmm.
notwithstanding. I think my favorite is that there's a crab puka, and they mention Smith Island, which is very well known among linguists. Briefly, also with the Duchy of Chesapeake, I think as cookie cutter as the Duke's freeholds could be, the authors have really gone out of their way to describe each one in unique ways that are like equally opulent.
Yeah.
I'll still take Zrori the Pony Puka and the Assateague Dunes though, and
Hmm.
Chincoteague, like Misty of Chincoteague, the novel.
Maybe that was the picture. A bunch of pony pukas. Buff
Oh
pony
yeah,
pukas.
those buff pony pukas. Um, and we get more about the Mimigweshi here. So yeah, this chapter bursting with information.
Yep. Okay. So now we're on chapter 3, politics and culture.
Do you know what else didn't age well in this book? Are the sort of 90s ideas of the fuzzy boundary between liberal and conservative in the United States.
Mm.
Like,
That was
things,
very 90s White Wolf. That's like Mage the Ascension right there.
yeah. And it actually starts, though, with like more extended metaplot spelled out.
Hmm.
And this is kind of the roots of the whole War in Concordia arc.
Yeah.
But very briefly, David has disappeared. Ferelith wants to continue as High Queen. David's sister Morwen refuses to allow this because she thinks Ferelith has something to do with his disappearance. They both have supporters in the Parliament. Some others think Morwen should be regent for Lenore, the heir, and a few others think there should be a lottery for a new High King. So
Hmm.
that all happened. And there's a note that Milge is generally popular. I can't understand why, except that most of his subjects seem to be like deep shadow court, so that's
No.
probably why.
No, they explain why. He's got a magic item that makes him popular.
Well, he's got a magic item, but also like there's a difference between thinking that he's an honest guy and liking his political choices.
Yeah.
And it's hard to differentiate between the two in here.
Hmm.
There's also this dynamic they point out where they're like, oh, ambition and intrigue run hot in the counties as opposed to the baronies and the duchies. And I'm like, well, why? I feel like I've never seen that before and I've never seen that again. But, yeah,
Middle management. There we go.
I guess so. When you're at
Yeah.
the bottom, the only place to climb is up.
They go through a bunch of political impulses stuff, which
I know.
I will just it's just
We're right back to the nobles, the shining host
it's
here.
just Nobles the Shining House stuff. And then a southern twist to states' rights. Anyway.
Yeah, well, that's like a dog whistle right there.
Yep.
I don't understand why the impulses keep coming up, but they're here.
Yep.
But yeah, there's the Sealy traditionalists who are like gone with the wind jerks, the reformers who are like constitutional monarchy beltway operatives, and the modernists who are university types.
Yep.
And then,
All the secret societies you know and love.
yeah. Oh, I did want to also, so the unseelie modernist impulse. Why is there like suddenly this obsession with cold iron? I noticed it a lot in this book that the Unseelie seem all in on iron, which, while they were always the ones more willing to use it in the
Hmm.
books, even for them, it seems like.
Yeah, I remember stuff about maybe some of them embracing, trying to find a way to embrace banality, but it's not like cold iron is a big part of the modern world. That
Right, yeah. And they just seem to have this love affair with it.
Yep. Anyway.
I'm just so uncomfortable with the separatists being hitched to the South stuff because it's just such a You know,
I mean,
slippery slope.
yeah, if they just called it the yeah. Anyway.
I get it. I just, ugh, it just feels like I need to take a bath.
Oh, and there's two new groups. Do we want to even mention them?
Oh well, so yeah. Then the societies mostly rehashes of the old ones.
Hmm.
I'm glad that C20 cut these down because there are too many of them.
Yeah, Cat's Cradle is get referenced a lot in this book.
Well, because Fairlith has been inducted, so I think the most interesting out of all the society stuff, which are also kind of, through the Southern
Yeah.
lens, is that the ranters, who are the radical commoners, are kind of like the backwoods folk, and that the catacomb club, the commoner nobles, here they seem to function maybe more overtly, I can't remember, as an anti-Beltane blade. And I actually really like that. And
Yeah.
they're kind of backroom political lobbyists, it calls them.
Yeah.
Overall, yeah, this didn't really. There is, yes, there are two new secret societies, one of whom they're supremacists. Skip. And then the Children of Annihilation, who I actually do kind of like, where they're unseelie extremist radicals that are trying to kind of inoculate themselves to banality and twisted glamour.
Hmm.
And they hang out in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the site of early research on the atomic bomb. There's story potential there.
Yep. Yeah, that I don't feel cringy bringing into my game,
No.
even if I would agree with them. Not moral. Well, yeah.
And I could see them making great villains. They're nice and twisted.
Yeah. And then politics, Southern style,
Ugh,
and
so painful to read.
and then honor.
Honor as the cardinal virtue in Southern culture. Extended section on duels is actually really useful. Like,
Yep.
Kingdom of Willows or no, I would absolutely use this
Yep.
dueling culture piece in a game.
See, I just read all this as just Sealy.
Yeah. I think what the sidebar on page 87 actually highlights is that, changelings, the She in particular, and players would care about mortal politics and the political implications of the different cultural pieces. Because I feel like
Hmm.
that's what this chapter is tilting at. And yeah, a lot of the stuff that is the traditionalist, conservative, I don't know, paternalistic, they say at one point, it does all smack
Hmm.
of Sealy to me.
Yep.
There's like a thing on the gift giving customs and manners,
And that's why,
hospitality.
that's why I like that. My favorite part of the Unseelie Code's honor is a lie. I'm like, yes.
Right. And like, there are Unseelie who are just outright evil in this book,
Yep.
but I kind of feel like pound for pound, the Sealy would have more of the folks that I would be not keen on. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, we get some festivals, which I'm always into.
Hmm.
And a throwaway mechanical note here that any changeling who participates in the funeral rites for another may gain a dot in remembrance, which is like,
Hmm.
well, that's hugely important and useful, and I'm going to use that as much as I can.
Yeah, and then we have a sidebar on old time religion. This gets brought up a little bit in here. I'm like, I did not mention House Liam at all here.
They do not.
And if you're gonna do that, I feel like you need House Liam there with everything we. Anyway.
Yeah, it's a very politely universalist summary of all of the religions in
Yeah.
the South. So,
Hmm.
I think this is the shortest chapter, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, I think so.
it's not very long. And I think they knew what they were up against when it came to representing Southern cultures. So their
Yeah.
strategy ended up being like mostly remaining silent on the histories of racism and colonialism. And they do present bits of the problematic stuff as outright evil, but A, sometimes it's not evil enough, like represented evil enough. And B, it sometimes feels like it was more virtue signaling because it's not counterbalanced by talking about good stuff.
Yeah.
Like they took enough risks for the chapter to be overall fine.
Yeah.
Maybe it's better than I should expect for 90s White Wolf, but still. That being said, if you're running a Kingdom of Willows game and you want all the ins and outs of the political dynamics, you're set with this chapter.
Yeah.
That concludes book 1.
Book 2.
Dreams of a Troubled Future.
Yeah. Chapter 4, Kithain of the Kingdom. This to me is if you really want to do a political game in Kingdom of Willows. This is the important chapter though.
So here's my soapbox moment. Here's what I'm going to say. I love this chapter. I love the way it was constructed and presented, which
Mm-hmm.
is basically the NPCs are not given stats, which is a bold choice, but I really like it because it lets you scale and tailor each one to your specific game, as well as freeing up more line space for their biographies.
Mhm.
I mean, they mention like, here are the arts they have, here are the treasures they have, but also they add the specific story connection, because what I'm really noticing, and this is the chapter where it really stood out to me, I think this book, what they're trying to do is improve upon the Immortal Eyes formula of trying to make a setting book that can involve the characters in the metaplot if the group
Yeah.
desires. But the metaplot they're doing is a lot more fluid with
Yeah.
more points of connection, because it's a political whodunit rather than a MacGuffin quest, like
Mhm.
the Immortal Eyes
Yeah,
were.
like this is how I'd want a campaign book or whatever, right?
Yeah,
Like when we get to the future books of the meta plot, whether or not it follows through that way, but like this, it's like you get this setup, you have lots of characters, later on they have advice, you get all this stuff going on, and it's like, go have fun.
yeah,
Whatever the player characters do, as long as they get involved in things are going to happen. And that's
yeah.
great.
That being said, some of these bios are probably longer than they need to
Yeah.
be. I mean, the first one is for Milga, and it's 2.5 solid pages of tiny text. So.
But it's also, I found this helpful. His write up
Well,
specifically.
yeah, I love it. I know a lot of people hate it, especially when, you're a player and you hand in a 5-page backstory and your storyteller's like, give me a break. But I love it. So, because it's these
Yeah.
entire vignette backstories.
But
Like,
there's a difference between a player handing me a 5-page backstory and I have to play this character.
yeah, I mean, it goes a long way towards giving you motivations, role-playing strategies, and hints and directions they're going, like their plots and plans. It's
Hmm.
very, very thorough.
Yeah. And he is the central character in many ways of
Yes.
this whole plot.
Well, but some of the other ones who are not by any means central have two
Yeah. No,
two-page
I just meant
bios.
his. I'm just defending his write up.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah. Let's go through. Okay, so we have the main characters, so Malga.
Yes. Melga is the King of Willows and the antagonist with double underlines. He's a commoner
Hmm.
hating Elenid She Shadow Court crime lord who murdered and replaced the previous and hated King Barabbas, and he has a mask that makes people like him.
Hmm. We have the Fairlith.
His adopted heir, a debutante who King David fell for and married, who's now showing more backbone in his absence than most people expected.
Yep. And is one of the High Queens.
The High Queen.
Yes, well, depends on who you
Or
ask.
so she would have it, yeah.
Yeah. We have Sif.
Safe. Which means sword, which
Yeah.
is a bit on the nose, but okay. He's a Muslim Ishu from Atlanta who was chosen by Caliburn to find David and thereby knighted. And he's probably the most straightforward, good major metaplot character.
Mhm.
He's like the paladin.
Yep. We have Real.
Melga's Spymaster Slua and Shadow Court Poisoner.
Who also gives me questions about how things are supposed to work in Colombia at the time, but anyway.
Yeah.
Sabrina Lennon Corvald. This is where I'm starting to be like, I have enough write-ups now. This is getting too long.
The subtitle for this book is Too Many Dukes.
Yep.
But Too Many Nobles.
Yep.
But Sabrina is the Leonin socialite and Shadow Court mover and shaker who hosted the ball where the king was abducted.
We have Baron O'Donnell.
The Unseeliskaha captain of the guard for Milga, and he kind of his handler.
Who's unseelie but sticks to the Sealy code for some reason, yes.
Yeah. When he's kind of like the pressure valve for Milga, like keeping him in check. I like that he has a sword that forces people to fight fair.
Yep. And then we have Wisteria Hall Savannah. I'll just go through these.
Just keep throwing names and I'll keep throwing descriptions.
Okay, Count Morig.
Privileged Gwydion preservationist, which is very difficult to say.
We have someone whose name I can't pronounce because I think it's Welsh.
Cruin. And
Cruin.
she's a walking stereotype that I don't really want to go into.
Yep.
And then briefly we get references to the Florist Primeval again, but that's in another book.
Yeah. Florist Primeval. We have Alina, Duchess of the Southern Coast.
I kind of like the notion of a fallen duchy, and I'm curious to hear more of that, because there is no Duchy of the Southern Coast. And it's like, what happened with that?
Baron Arwan and Baroness Eloine.
Trying to unmask King Melga. I see what you did there, writers.
Yep. And then we get the Duchy of Cotton, Duke Firedrake, the Iron King.
Yes. He was raised from toddlerdom by a Shadow Court lady, and he's the ironmonger to the king, as well as keeper of a chimerical dragon, who's wonderful.
Oh, that's the dragon that I like. Yeah, that's the...
Yes. He thinks he's the seneschal.
That dragon's like one of my favorite NPCs in this book. And then Grania of House Gwydion, the unacknowledged Duchess.
Yes, she's an ally of Fairlith. She is loved by Firedrake, and I believe her freehold makes people go into Bedlam, if I
Yeah, she's
remember
not. She
correctly.
keeps feeling bad. She's not taking care of her duchy that may or may not exist. Yeah,
Yes.
and then the Right Reverend Perseverance Matthews.
Also known as Percy,
Yep,
the evangelical pelican puka who does faith healings.
yep. This feels like you get like Cards Against Humanity, or like a bunch of cards. It just changeling like adjectives and stuff and nouns. You just pulled it out.
I often feel that way about most of the NPC sections in these books, though, to be fair.
Yeah, but that one worked. I thought.
Yep.
Duchy of Delta Crescents, Lisette LeVay.
She is the Balor Black Spiral Dancer kinfolk Bayou Voodoo Queen who makes the glamour soaked drug for Melga that he uses to drug David and Fairlith.
Mm-hmm. We have Pearl, Baroness of the Big Easy.
Which is the best title of any character. But she's an Ishu who owns the riverboat freehold known as the Mississippi Pearl.
We have the Duchy of Palmetto, Duke Antoine. There we go.
Antoine.
Yeah.
He is a Vietnamese refugee Liam Shi who's ostracized by the others for his origins.
Yeah. So they have a Liam and no connection to all that religious stuff they're talking about. Okay.
Yeah.
Scintilla, Mistress of the
Gullah Freeland. Yes.
Yep.
She's an Ishu who's been awake for over 80 years, and she is the de facto head of the Free State. But I don't think
She's planning on being around at least for another 20 years.
At least.
Maybe you could still have her in your game now.
I think she's still around.
Yeah. Then we have Duchy of the Triangle, Duke Murdoch of House Dougal, the professor.
Yeah, so as someone who is an adjunct instructor, whenever students call me professor, I get this bittersweet feeling where I want to be like, thank you, kids, but not yet. And that's what I imagine he's like, because he's just a lecturer at UNC Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
But he made Milk's mask.
Yeah, he also... Are they calling him like a Star Trek Vulcan and he just doesn't know get the reference?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. And then we have Rooster Langler, his knocker. I think I like their relationship.
Well, his best friend as well.
Yeah.
He's into car racing and customizing cars for racing.
He's not really into car racing. He's just into customizing cars for racing.
For racing, yeah.
Yeah.
He's the pit crew for the Duke.
Yeah. Duchy of Appalachia, Duchess Dianan.
I really feel like she was just an excuse to mention the Jonesboro Storytelling Festival, but
yeah, she gets like almost 2 pages to do that.
Yeah, but she's also the daughter of an autumn person. There's some of that pre-Shattering She stuff, and she has a former lover who's a troll.
Count Bjorno?
That's the one. So it seems like they had crossed the ocean and then fled into the dreaming and then were reincarnated 600 years later or something. But yes, he is her troll bodyguard and former lover. And he once found the Cup of Dreams.
Hollis Burnett, mayor of Coaltown.
A knocker former coal miner who runs the Thorpe.
Gadiel of House Baelor, Lord of the Twisted Oak.
Yes. He's sort of a mishmash constructed from various decadent Unseelie bits, but I think I actually like him as a villain.
Yeah, this made me think, though, we needed, like, I wish this came out after Book of Lost Houses, just so we could have more houses for some of these.
But he works as a Balor, I feel.
Yeah, I think, yeah. And so does the other Baelor. Or Balor.
He happily murders people, happily experiments with dark glamour, happily has, like, misshapen servants and whatever, and, you know, classic.
There's a picture in his write-up. I don't know what she's supposed to be. A giant woman or something? I don't know.
I think she's hanging out with the Nunyahi little people.
Okay. Other appellation, Kithain. So it's like, oh, we're out of the noble Countess Teresa Balsam.
Oh, yeah. Well, these are the ones that we saw before.
Yeah.
So.
High Castle Crafters.
As seen in Freeholds and Hidden Glens.
Duchy of Bluegrasses, Duke Araby Ap Gwydion.
He raises fairy steeds, but then he also has a secret identity as super vigilante Lord Justice. Basically Batman.
Garvey, Seneschal of Bluegrasses.
It's his Alfred. I mean, it's Batman and Alfred. That's what it is.
And then the other Kithain of the area. So we have Django Hillrunner.
He is an Ishu renter musician with Nunyahi connections. Opportunity to talk more about the musical culture that wasn't really taken very far.
Yep. Jaruna?
Cave Slua Matriarch.
Duchy of Graceland.
Yeah, here he is.
God.
A little Confederate Elvis asshole.
So just staying that description, I think could have worked as a villain for this book. But they keep harping on how he's not racist, and I'm like, what are you?
Yep. It's that kind of thing, which I'm just like, I want to throw the book across the room.
Yeah, and then Calvert.
His red cat bodyguard. Enough said.
Yeah. Duchy of Ozarks. Carrie Dunwood.
I actually find her interesting because I think she's the only Slua who's a noble with this level of title. And she is a gymnast who's the heir to the duchy, but functionally the duchess because her predecessor was exiled for being too reformist, too commoner loving. And I think she's actually pretty cool. She wanted to be an Olympic gymnast, but then she crystallized. So, alas.
Duchy of Dogwood. Duke Cormac Dathy.
So it's Cormac, but then also
Yeah.
Baron Ash, his lover. This is the gay couple with lack of self-awareness because he made his best friend and lover a baron, and a lot of people freaked out about that.
But hey, there's nothing about what this is the 90s, and neither of them died, so I think we have to give bonus points to that. But Count Rule of James River.
The old money Gwydion who thinks he deserves the dukedom.
Then Washington, D.C., Duke Siva and Duchess Kali.
The Balor and Aelil twins, who are children of Indian immigrants and who claim autonomy over the Duchy of Shadows so they can mess stuff up in DC.
Yeah, this gets into weird metaphysical and history questions about Changeling that don't get answered anywhere else. So.
Frankly, there are weirder ones, though.
Yes. In this
I'll
book,
take
even,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Ayami, Seneschal of the Court of Mirrors? Yeah.
Another Liam, a Japanese-American Liam who manages David's secret DC court, the Court of Mirrors.
Yep. Othered Washington Kithain, Balthazar, the Baron of Washington.
Raccoon Puka, who eats dreams of politics.
He's very cuddly.
Yes, he's my favorite.
Madame Varvara.
A satyr shadow court informant who experiments with creating sex dross that goes awry.
The disputed Duchy of Winterthorn, Duke
Gorir.
Yeah, Apquidian.
He's a Gwydion in Bedlam with a whole-ass chimerical daughter. And he resents Duke Araby because he's like, oh, you just run around breeding horses. And he has no idea that the Duke is actually a crime-fighting vigilante.
Duchy of Chesapeake, Duchess Helena and Anastasia.
Yeah, she's a Russophile, so she gave herself an extensive Russian name. And I'm like, okay. But she's a Fiona party planner, and she's very popular in the Kingdom of Willows, and she has a pretty cool treasure. It's like a get-out-of-death-free card.
King Jasper the Wicked.
Her ward, who is a Shadow Court childling hellion of a satyr who plans to eventually off the Duchess.
Yep.
They really invested in working the Shadow Court under the surface of a lot of these.
Yeah, it feels a bit overstuffed, but usually these things are understuffed, so I'm okay with that.
Yeah, it's true.
Strolling players. So you haven't heard of him, but his name's High King David.
And yeah, you got nothing to say.
They have very little to say about him, actually.
Well, this is like the 4th time he's gotten a write-up, so...
Yeah, they actually just summarize him in this book, basically.
Yes.
How do you pronounce the next one?
Llay Arduad.
Yeah.
He's basically Lancelot, and now he's the Queen's bodyguard instead of the King's.
Mm-hmm. And then we have more art that... Wait, is this a Nosferatu about to eat some she?
Yes, I think so. Yes. As we move into chapter 5. Let's just keep going. Let's just get through the other ones.
Chapter 5, Gallain and Others.
Nunyehi.
A lot of Nunyehi.
And they're much more fleshed out here. They actually point to mortal lives, and I'm like, thank you, finally.
Yep.
Not just the one-dimensional paper cutout. They have war bands that we keep getting.
Yeah. So. We have Grey Eagle.
Chief of the Achota Council lands, a Nunyehi Indian rights activist who hates Melge.
Azusa Whitestone.
An elder Yunwitsunsi who manages Spirit Rock Freehold in the Duchy of Cotton.
Crying Tears.
A Nunyehi allied with the Garou and the Puka, who wants to just preserve stories.
I'm just trying to aligned with the Puka, like just.
Well, who wouldn't be?
Yeah, okay. The Puka is a monolithic political group. So it's Ayana Flower That Blooms.
A Thoughtcrafter ambassador who works at Jamestown. I was thinking about this earlier because they make reference to how the site of Jamestown is also a sacred space called the cleansing place for the
Hmm.
local Nunyihi. Wouldn't that also be kind of banal, though? Because it's kind of like the flashpoint of English colonialism in history.
Yeah.
So
Well, if a sacred site's been defamed, it's still sort of a sacred site. But
I guess so, yeah. I guess someone has to keep the lights on. And it's Ayana flower that blooms in this case.
yeah. Smiling River,
A Mimigweshi lifeguard at the Blackwater Refuge.
Leaping Waters.
A Yunwi Ameinehi outdoorsy prankster at White Foam, which I think was like a whitewater freehold.
Hmm. Then we have the Lost Ones, Lord Tamlin.
A pre-shattering she lost in the mountains, previously seen in Freeholds and Hidden Glens.
It says Fiddler of Lost Dreams. That predates fiddling, doesn't it?
Fair point.
Ciridwilla? Sweet Magnolia?
Yes, a lost one locked in a stand of pink magnolia trees for centuries. And what is happening in that art? Good lord. Her tentacles with teeth have come out to play.
It reminds me of some experiments I've done with AI art when it just goes, what are you doing here?
Accurate.
And now we have the Ananime.
Yeah.
Another take on the Ananime that's different from Ananime the Secret Way.
I
So,
think every single take we've gotten so far has been different.
yeah. Statuaries, also called golems. And they also say here, well, nymphs are technically Ananime. They are listed separately.
Well, here they're becoming an anime at this point, and they're both tree associated. So I'm like, I feel like they meant for these to be Kubera.
The trees and rock formations.
I mean, the two examples in this case are both linked to trees.
Yeah. Wherein the Angel Oak and Evelyn, the Lady of Bayou St. John.
Evangeline.
Hey, maybe river hags are actually a type of nymph.
Potentially. We'll have to discuss that when we get to Kithbook Redcap. But I quite like Evangeline, the Lady of Bayou St. John, because she's struggling, but she likes riddles and songs, and people visit her, and she's the Bayou Queen. She also has unlimited amounts of kenning, which is like, what does that even mean? But
Yeah, there's a few little mechanics. Somebody here has like a treasure gives you seduction 1 or something. I was like, what? Anyway, prodigals. We have vampires. I think I like Dominic G. Fellows.
I do like him, yeah. The G is for Giovanni.
His pseudo friendship, which he can with the king.
So he's like a rival crime lord, which is like that's a direction I don't think I've ever seen Changeling go, but I'm here for it.
Yep.
Vampires, generally avoided but thoroughly present, because this is the South.
We have werewolves. Monica Hawthorne, Glasswalker, who just does not understand what banality is.
She wants to monetize Duke Murdoch's creations, and he's like, no.
And then we have mages. Annalie Bonadieu, Spirit Talker. I was, from a mage perspective, I'm confused by her, but
She's kind of a Unitarian priestess in New Orleans, I guess.
of the Dream Speakers.
It is useful that they give the note here that there's Celestial Chorus in the Bible Belt, Euthanatos in New Orleans,
Yeah.
the Dream Speakers being embedded in communities of color. I'm kind of like, sigh. And then the Verbena in the backwoods on ancient fairy sites, I'm also like, sigh. But
yeah. And then Wraiths, once again, there's something weird about Changeling books that comes up sometimes. These are not Wraiths, these are ghosts.
I never played enough Wraith to have much thought on that, but I get the point.
Like, it's an interesting ghost character. I wouldn't even call them NPC because they're not playable enough.
Well, he has a fetter at least.
Yeah. But it's like they're trapped in this thing. I don't know if Wraith has something like that. But I thought,
It's an interesting character, though. I mean, they mention that there are so many Wraiths in the area, which makes sense. But it's the Confederate soldier who killed his Union soldier brother and feels like eternal guilt.
Yeah.
He's undergone so many harrowings that his memories have been stripped from him.
And then we're told there are Dantean, Mortals, Enchanted, and Autumn people in the South.
Well, I think the Enchanted and the Autumn people are both subcategories for the Mortals.
Yeah, that's true.
The headers do weird things in this book.
Yeah.
And the general notes on them, they certainly run the gamut. I think the emphasis on the more banal types being caught up in things like the moral panic stuff and the culture wars, like that's the kind of antagonists that I think we need more attention to here.
Mm-hmm.
But I could actually see myself using some of these, which is very rare for the throwaway Gawain chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And very few of them, maybe none of them, are actually integrated into the metaplot story. Like,
One of them sort of is
yeah,
the vampire.
yeah, that's true. So overall, I mean, what are your thoughts on the two character chapters? Because we did just fly through
Yeah.
about 70 pages. So,
Like we said about some of those character write-ups were too long for the character. And I feel like I'm wondering if there's a way this book could have been organized differently to make it easier, because it's just this giant same character descriptions for many, many pages.
the only thing that I think they could have done maybe differently, because the way I see it is that if you wanted to run a game in the Kingdom of Willows, what you should first do is pick the specific duchy in which you want to run it,
Mm-hmm.
and then kind of cross reference the geography section with the characters. And maybe having like 13 mini chapters would have worked better to kind of pull that information together.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. But then within the Ozarks chapter would have been
Well,
10
right, then
pages.
yeah, exactly. So it looks better when it's like this.
Yeah.
Um but I mean, it gives you a lot of freedom to run the game and the story connections that you want to make
Yeah.
to the meta plot and kind of modulate it to what you need. Because, like I said, each of these bios, for the most part, they're rich enough for their own chapter or even story within a larger chronicle.
Yeah, I think as a
So,
whole, it's good to have this for certain complaints we've brought up aside and issues. But
yeah,
like as a whole, I think it's useful for running in the Kingdom of Willows.
yeah. And to your point about the sort of Cards Against Humanity method of kind of assembling character traits, I feel like they went out of their way to kind of wave their arms and say, not everyone in the South is white, which, yeah, good. I'm down with that. It sometimes felt like tokenism.
Yeah.
So, but I'd rather have an attempt at diversity rather than no diversity. That being
Mm-hmm.
said, all of the She Dukes, for the most part, still seem to be white, with the exception of
Yeah.
Antoine. So,
Though there's also the Baelor. She was not a duke, I guess, but yes, all most of the she are white.
yeah.
And then we have chapter 6 storytelling that starts it with kind of like a summary of what happened.
Should we say spoiler here? And
Yeah,
if you want to
spoiler.
actually run this chronicle, maybe don't listen to the next minute
Yeah.
or so.
Well, no, play
Um,
this chronicle.
yes, play this chronicle. Running this chronicle, you do want to listen.
Or at least read it. Yeah.
So step by step, Melga wants the throne of Concordia, so he plots to get rid of David. He organizes a meet cute between his ward Fairlith and the High King, but they unexpectedly fall for each other. I also didn't realize before reading this how creepy Morwen comes across here, because it's like she's David's sister, but they used to be lovers. And I'm like, well, that's weird. But I guess it's like a Morgan Le Fay sibling
Mm-hmm.
incest thing.
Well, it's also like they were before they took over the bodies, and it's kind of like, ugh.
Yeah.
It's some Star Wars stuff.
Still, though.
Yeah.
So eventually, David and Fairlith get married on Beltane and decide to do this royal grand tour that starts in the Kingdom of Willows to honor David's new, I guess, sort of father in law. And
Mm-hmm.
then at the masked ball, Melga glamour drugs them both so he can have David abducted and push Fairlith into claiming the throne, which he then plans to seize. But unexpectedly, Caliburn abandons David and arrives at Sir Safe, and Fairlith is like, I'm going to knight you, you go find my
Yeah,
husband. And
there's something here. I can think of why, but I would have liked it if they put it, especially in this chapter, if they put in why he didn't kill David.
it is in here. I
Okay.
can't remember where.
Okay.
It's because, like, if he killed David, then David would reincarnate, kind of thing, I think was part
Or
of
at
it.
least Caliburn would move on to the next thing or
Right.
something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like, it would have been too messy.
Mm-hmm.
There is reference to why.
Yeah.
Anyway, so then the Queen's going to continue the tour. Sertley becomes her guard, and Mjadga is forced to go to additional plots. There's another reference where they say that this is starting off the meta plot for the successive Kingdom books for Changeling, and it just makes me think about what could have been.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, the predominant story strand to come out of all of this is the power struggle between Fairlith and Morwen and Lenore's supporters. And
Yeah.
then there's this note that the upheaval in the land reflects the confusion that David is experiencing. And it makes me think, like, with the king land connection, what must be going on in the Concordian dreaming at this point? Like, the chimerical
Ah.
world must just be a mess.
Yeah. The near dreaming got beat up by iron and drugged and
Yeah.
possibly going to a strip club. I was a little bit unclear on that from this.
And drinking.
Yeah, I hadn't read this before C20. I'm like, oh, I understand C20 a little bit more
Yeah.
now with the Return of David.
Yeah, I mean, this definitely gives a lot of context for all of it.
Yep. And they talk about there's like there's a few things. There's you can do the Chronicle of Caliburn.
It says that Safe is seeking knighthood, but he's actually already been knighted, and it makes me think, oh, he's seeking to earn his knighthood, which I think is a really nice character
Yep.
trait. There's the theme of masks that gets highlighted here, where it's like literal masks in some cases, but then also these figurative ones, like people having a double agenda or being underestimated. And ultimately, it does a better job of kind of hitching together the Shakespearean with the Arthurian
Mm-hmm.
than Immortalized did, I think. But
Yep.
we have some other story ideas because not everybody wants to structure their chronicle around a manufactured metaplot, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
Except then the three that we get, it's like Decay in the South, which is still centered on King Melchior, the country story, which is slice of life in the South, and I'm like, all right. And then Battlefield Dreams, which I'm definitely going to take a hard pass on because I don't play Changeling to do Civil War reenactment stuff. So I would say if you want other story ideas, go look at any of the 50 biographies that are 2 pages long.
Well, there's also all the regional stories.
Yeah, I mean, they're fine. I think my favorites are probably Bluegrasses because you can run a story that's basically Batman's horse has escaped. And then The Duchy of Cotton is a Shakespearean love farce, romantic farce. So
Mm-hmm.
there's also Nunyahu stories, which aren't really fleshed out, and crossover stories, which, all right, like I said, I think the Giovanni rivalry one could
Yeah.
go the most places. And I would love to see like a Wraith Changeling Halloween crossover. That's deep Southern
Mm-hmm.
Gothic, you know. More Southern Gothic is necessary.
Yep. How to tell a Southern story.
How do we tell a Southern story, Josh?
I don't know. This book helped me with that.
Well, it's like, oh, there's a long tradition of storytelling. Okay. Isn't that true for most places?
You have to establish mood.
Using natural landscapes and eating establishments.
Okay, but this doesn't tell me people eat food. Okay, I know that there's Creole cooking and there's seafood in Maryland. I assume Louisiana is what they mean. That's it. And don't do bad accents. Okay, that's actually helpful. And don't be too stereotypical.
Which is pretty rich coming from a 90s White Wolf book.
I mean, as far as 90s White Wolf books go,
Yeah.
I thought.
I mean, it's thin advice, but it's good. So.
And then we have a timeline that I think starts out with something that they said differently. Because it repeatedly says that he was elected King of Willows in 1990.
It does, yes.
And now it's saying 1975.
Yeah, well, inconsistencies.
It's like how technocracy agents are enchanted longer.
Yeah. I do wonder if it would have been better to have the inspirational media stuff here, because if you're talking about how to tell a Southern story, it seems like that's when you would want to have that. But as a chapter, it's fine.
Yep. And then there's a picture that just makes me have questions.
Any particular ones?
Can I play the deer centaur?
Sure.
And I don't know who has the fiddle, but I think he's mortal. Doesn't have pointed ears, at least. This is a very fairy story, but not changeling picture. Sorry, I wonder what the art direction notes were.
I'm willing to forgive Rebecca Guay for almost anything. So.
Yep.
But yes, as we enter the appendix, we get the 14th Nunyahi, the Thought Crafters, who I actually really like them. I think that they're disgustingly overpowered, but they're fantastic.
They're my favorite Nunyahi because they're like knockers.
Well, and they're not really culture specific. They're kind of a generalized trickster / crafter, Eastern Seaboard Algonquian origin.
But yeah, if they wanted to make some people want Kiths to not be so culture specific, I'm like, this is one that would still be there.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good example of like how to do that, I think.
And then we have totem spirits.
They're fine.
And when you get this is the one with the Magnolia gives you an additional point appearance and seduction 1.
But you can't pick her delicate blossoms.
Yeah. What is seduction 1? And what if you already have seduction 2?
You know how to pout. Well, no, you shouldn't have seduction too, because nobody should be spending dots on secondary abilities.
Yeah. Is it an established secondary ability, or is it? Did
Oh
they
yeah,
break it up?
absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
Unlike the other book where we had someone who had spitting 3, that is not, to my knowledge, an established one. Anyway, the Thoughtcrafters get bonuses to dexterity and wits, and they can restore or intensify glamour, and their only drawback is that they're curious. Seems like a fair trade to me.
Yeah, I mean, this is still second edition. And then we have treasures.
Yes, we have actual stats for Caliburn, which is pretty awesome. It does a lot. It does a lot of stuff.
And then it says it might do other things. I liked it.
Yeah.
And it teleports around. It gets away from you. It's a lot of avoiding problems.
Yep.
For it, not you. Not the wielder.
We also have White Lightning, which is moonshine that causes people who drink it to be under the effects of chicanery 1.
Mm-hmm.
And the Riddle Master, which I loved, which is a dulcimer that has Soothsay 1 and gives cryptic clues through its music.
There's fiddles.
Which are an early example here, the fiddle focus of like, just put a cantrip in your treasure.
Well, actually, that's also what Riddle Master is, really.
It's true, but I still like it better than the fiddles.
Yep. Dreambane.
Yes. The glamour drug, designed by Lisette. And Dream Shield, its antidote.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, some cool treasures. And some cool creatures. Fey steeds, fey hounds. Both of which are very important in Fey stories, so it's good to have stats and powers for them here. But again, shout out to Andrew Goodman and Paved with Good Intentions.
I like his. I think his was an improvement upon these.
Agreed. But this is where they all start.
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused with the power. What power do they actually have, the horses? They can enter trods? Does that mean they open trods that couldn't normally be opened? Or do they just happen to come along with you when you open a trod? Or
No, I think it's you can ride one into a trod without needing to open it yourself.
Okay, that's very useful. And the dog can do it too. This is like the weird dog show dogs possibly are coming from fairy hound breeds.
Yes.
You're a Chinese crested Chihuahua mix or something.
Outside my area of expertise, I'll admit.
Okay. And then we get a picture with a naked fairy in the Kingdom of Willows.
Yes, the map. And the map is actually useful, I think, because they don't just show the borders, they actually mark all of the like freeholds and enchanted places.
And it fits the description. Too.
Yes. It is actually a map of what they've been talking about.
Yep.
And then my book ends with an ad for Sorcerer's Crusade and an ad for Vampire Revised.
Nice. But I'm using the PDF, so it's just the boring.
Oh,
what is the Onyx Path?
I wish that there were more glass icons for like freeholds and books and concept specific stuff, because I really like the little willow with a crown that's on the back cover.
So, what do you think of this book?
Oh, God, that was a marathon. Well, overall, I think that if a bit outdated and kind of glossing over a few things, it is indispensable for anyone who wants to run a chronicle in the Kingdom of Willows, or who wants to engage with the core of the early second edition metaplot that directly informed the C21.
Yeah, it really explained the metaplot to me. There were some details I did not understand from reading some of the other books.
This is where it comes from.
Oh, yeah.
And I love the format and the approach they took. I will admit the Kingdom of Willows is not a setting that I'm particularly interested to run a game in, but I really like how they constructed their take on it. So, yeah, I think it's decent.
I wish there was more books like this for when, like, if you have more of a globe trotting or at least Concordia trotting game, right? So you're like, oh.
Well, apparently there were supposed to be.
Yeah. You're going to spend 3 sessions in the Kingdom of Willows. Well, this book's handy, right? Just to pull stuff out.
Yeah.
And know what to ignore. But
therein lies the rub.
Yeah. But I think it's pretty obvious what to ignore for at least most people I know.
Yeah. It certainly earned its page count.
And I think for its, I don't think it's lost utility that much since it came out.
It's true. Particularly because in C20 they kept most of the nobles the exact same people. So
yeah, they did some other later metaplot reversals in C20, but they didn't reverse this one, it seems. So
yep.
Okay,
we have a couple questions from the Discord. From Andrew Goodman, we have, why was there no love for Maryland in this book? as someone that grew up in the state, there's so much that could be done with the Duchy of Chesapeake. Of course, it doesn't really fit culturally with the rest of the Kingdom of Willows, so maybe it should be its own little pseudo kingdom like Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
I would say I don't think it should be its own pseudo kingdom, but I would be fine with it being hitched to the Kingdom of Apples instead. I do
Mm-hmm.
think there's love for the story of the Duchess and her ward and the political backstories in the DC Fae, but they have very little to do with like the state of Maryland itself or the district itself.
Yep.
And again, like I said, I think that there were a few blind spots in the author's direct experience. Like Arkansas, I suspect they didn't spend much time in Maryland.
I would have liked an Arkansas in-depth thing because I have no idea what to do with Arkansas.
Right.
So maybe.
Me neither. And it does feel a little imbalanced as a result that some territories get so much compared to the rest.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, I will point out once again Awakenings on the Storyteller's Vault by Ian Lemke is set in Baltimore, and perhaps
Mm-hmm.
there will be a link in the show notes. So then Andrew also asks, on that note, just how much do you think mortal ideas of their country should shape the Fey landscape? Should DC be more of a thing? Is Milka driven by dreams of the South rising again? Do or should mortal politics influence Fey politics? And if so, then how and how much? The obvious answer is as much as you and your players want them to, but I'd love to hear what people think and have done in their own games.
I think I don't quite like the balance it does in Changeling in general. I like more of a unconscious vibe thing.
Hmm.
So like I feel like the Fey society should reflect what mortals who live there would think about that place.
Mm-hmm.
But not, oh, Washington D.C. is the capital, so obviously King David needs a place there, and then okay, we're going to do everything along state line. The lines of culture and where the dreams thing don't really always follow the official political boundaries.
It's true.
There's a lot of situations where like, okay, yeah, those two places might be in the same state, but like maybe one state over, like you know what I mean, like draw the lines not always
Yeah, yeah,
along
yeah.
state lines. Having the South as a kingdom, sure, but maybe it doesn't have to be exactly the.
Yeah. Overall, I think the book thinks that mortal and fey politics should influence each other, and I'm okay with that.
Hmm.
But I do think it's better to err on the side of less is more, in
Hmm.
part because I feel like fey political concerns would kind of be, they would cut across mortal concerns, but like there would be some issues they would care passionately about, and then have fey problems that don't matter to mortals, and then have other political
Yeah,
things that they'd have zero stake in.
yeah,
So like it doesn't
yeah.
map.
They're not going to care which laws were passed in the state versus the other
Some of
state.
them,
They
some of
will.
them
They
they'll
might. You
care.
might care about the law. No, sure. But I mean, is it's not going to make it so it's like okay. First of all, you have things like freeholds with trods, so even borders are kind of funny like that. But like with between states, like what is it that makes it two states distinct is not necessarily the same thing that makes two duchies or kingdoms or whatever distinct.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
even if you're going by what the mortals are. Yeah,
Just as a postscript, I also want to say I don't think Milgia is driven by dreams of the South rising again. I think he's just power hungry and opportunistic.
yeah.
So, and then a storyteller asks, King Milgia is the only king in Concordia to depose a ruler from the Accordance War. Is this something that was underdeveloped or an unresolved plot hook? And yes, absolutely.
Yeah, there's too many. Like oh, they all live in their freeholds, but even if you're not aging out, I don't think the Fae should be that. Even if you're like a duke, like there's assassinations, there's just like things happen. Like something could happen to make you no long. Even if you're not deposed, you could go through the forgetting. You could just mortal death. You could get lost in the dreaming. You could fall to bedlam and.
I mean, I'm okay with the political assassination being a piece of the history,
Mhm.
especially because it factors so heavily into Milgia's biography and a
Yeah.
few others. But what I find interesting is how Changeling kind of picks and chooses which pieces of its own history are more important than others. And
Hmm.
I feel like, yeah, with this one in particular, because like you said, it's 1990, not 1975. So at the time of this book's writing, that's still pretty recent. And there should be more about those ripple effects from
Hmm.
the murder of someone who's basically still an unseen character. So
Yeah, he should still be built. Like he's power hungry, but it sounds like he's pretty cemented his kingdom at that point. Which, if all the kings are typically like, if the previous king was around that
right.
long,
Like, surely he still has supporters or pretenders or whatever. And all of the people
yeah,
who are against Melga seem to be against him less for that, because Barabbas was awful, and more for, like, his own.
yeah,
So, But it's more of a high-level political arc than we get elsewhere in the line, so I guess for people who want that, it's good.
Is it like all the other monarchs have been around since like Concordia was founded?
Kind of, yeah. Well, Aeron hasn't, because Aeron, we had a whole
Yeah.
subplot with her. But yeah, I think all the rest of them
Okay.
have.
Yeah, I think it was just like half of them that would make more
Yeah.
sense.
They should all be in Bedlam by now.
Mm-hmm. Especially since it was before C20.
Yes. But anyway, thanks for the questions, listeners.
Yeah.
So, Josh, if other people want to reach out and leave us questions for episodes, where can they go?
Yeah. Well, they can email us, podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. They can go to our Discord. That's the best way to get in touch with us, I think. Discord.me/CTP. You can go to our website, changelingthepodcast.com. You can send us a toot, changelingpod@dice.camp. That's on Mastodon. You can go to our Facebook page, which is beginning some more engagement, actually, for Changeling the Podcast. That's all of them, right?
I think so, yes. Or just send balloons with messages attached. We'll get them.
Yeah. So,
right on.
Once again, I'm Josh.
I am legally compelled to admit that I am still Puka.
Yeah. And yeah, when the guy says he's all Confederate happy, no, he's racist. I'm sorry, I don't remember what the book says.
Yeah, basically. And just, steer clear of all things Elvis related. It's better for everybody. Advice for the future. In the spirit of this book's attention to detail on enchanted places, here's an experiment, zooming in on the Kingdom of Willows portion on the map of unusual and surprising locations provided by Atlas Obscura, mostly in search of deer centaurs, or perhaps the stream populated by distractingly buff horsehead men. A few random clicks led to the Land of Oz in Beach Mountain, North Carolina, a somewhat decrepit theme park inspired by, of course, all things Oz-related. Attractions range from a tilting house meant to simulate being inside a tornado, to a museum featuring props from the film, no doubt laden with glamour. While the park is now sporadically open for an autumn festival and other events, its somewhat vandalized and half-abandoned state could make an interesting freehold for the right motley. Anyway, this has been an experiment. Such exercises are fostered by the support of our listeners, first and foremost our patrons, namely Derek, Dorcadus, Jason Vines, Oreo, Raz Caboose, Sanjigger, Sija, Terry Robinson, and Tricera Beth. If you want to help us continue bringing Changeling content from our voice box into your earballs, you can sign up to join these hallowed ranks at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast, and or feel free to leave a review on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience. Thanks very much for listening, and until next time, keep on dreaming.